De La Salle University has existed for more than 100 years. It is cool to be part of this traditional yet global institution that embraces cultural diversity.
My professors have been so helpful and encouraging. They guide me to the right coursework and program. They continue to teach me to strive for academic excellence.
I'm comfortable with the facilities, particularly with the Learning Commons, as it offers a lot of rooms to study and research. Also, the assistance and support of library personnel are superb.
My exchange experience opened doors of opportunities I did not know I could have before. It was a very life-changing, unexpected journey, and it undoubtedly is the highlight of my college experience.
The program has helped me deal with people from different backgrounds and work ethics, and it is a learning experience that would forever leave a mark in me.
The Mindanao State University was officially created by law by virtue of Republic Act 1387 as amended. The principal author of this act was the late Senator Ahmed Tumukaw A. Alonto Sr., the university founding father. MSU is the first state university in the southern part of the Philippines in Mindanao, and second to the University of the Philippines, being the first and premier state-sponsored institution of higher education in the country. MSU was formally established on September 1, 1961 in Marawi City, formerly called as Tansalan, the capital city of the province of Llana del Sur. Aspiring to be the center of excellence in instruction, research, and extension by transforming itself into a globally competitive national peace university, MSU System is committed to lead in social transformation through peace education and integration of Muslims and other cultural minority groups into the mainstream society, ensure excellence in instruction, research development, innovation, extension, and environmental education and discovery, advance national and international linkages through collaborations, and demonstrate greater excellence, relevance, and inclusiveness for Mindanao and the Filipino nation. From a one-campus university, the Mindanao State University transformed into an 11-campus university system with a total student population of 82,064 and a faculty force of 3,444 in 2015. Each campus is headed by a chancellor or superintendent for the 3 integrated technical vocational education campuses. Presently, MSU is the largest government university in the Philippines in terms of student population. The university president is the head of the whole MSU system and is concurrently the chief executive officer of MSU Marawi campus. The president also serves as the ex officio vice chairman of the Board of Regents, the highest policy-making body of the university. The Office of the President caters all services to 11 campuses. It also oversees the excellence of academic and support plans, policies, and programs of the university and all of its component entities, leads the institution in acquiring resources for the development and implementation of initiatives, guides important governance precedents, collaborates with a wide range of internal and external stakeholders, supervises the relationship between students and administration, and executes personnel system. The Office of the President is located in the Administration Building of Marawi Campus. Over the years, AMSU Marawi as the mother campus has transformed to an extremely modernized academic institution which holds aloft the desire to maintain quality education. At present, the university operation is complemented by the university's physical plant and facilities. These include the recently completed academic buildings that are equipped with contemporary classrooms, laboratories, athletic facilities, health service facilities, food service facilities, convention center, student center, gymnasium, dormitories, cultural center, and other facilities that are used to enhance the delivery of services of the university.
And good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the international webinar on social research methods in the era of digital technology and sustainable development goals. And we shall now proceed to the afternoon session. And this afternoon's first session is doing online ethnographic research. Okay. Our speaker this afternoon is an associate professor and graduate program coordinator of the Department of Communications of De La Salle University. He received his PhD in Communication Studies from the University of Leeds in the UK. So without much further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Jason Vincent A. Cabanes.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. And thank you so much to the organizers for inviting me to talk in this event. Let me just pull up my slides before I start. All right, so I hope everyone is able to see what I'm trying to share on my screen at the moment. Right, so for my talk, I want to focus on doing online ethnographic research. I hope to take about 20-30 minutes or so for this, and then I'd be very excited to engage with you in terms of your questions and comments. So what is online ethnographic research in media and communication studies? I guess it's important to begin by situating this kind of approach vis-a-vis other kinds of approaches in the social sciences. And when we talk about ethnographic research in our field, but also very useful to other fields in the social sciences, we talk about an in-depth and bottom-up approach to research. Okay? It's just that in the field of media and communication studies particularly, we do this kind of in-depth and bottom-up research so that we're able to situate people's media practices, in particular their online media practices, in the context of their everyday lives. So in-depth in the sense that what we really aim for is this rich, thick description of how they use media in the context of their lives. We don't necessarily aim for broad generalization, something that quantitative research, for example, can do. But what we do offer is depth and richness of data. Our work also tends to be bottom up, and what that means is that we don't often come into the field with fixed theories and then try to see if those theories work. Instead, we go out there, have a bit of an inkling of what we want to research about, but see what is really on the ground, and from that develop conceptual approaches. Okay, so it's the reverse of kind of like applying a theory. Here, we look at reality and generate theories on the basis of what's on the ground. So this is the spirit of ethnographic research in media and communication studies. It's also worth noting that when we say ethnographic, we mean ethnographic quote unquote. I do know that there are people in particular fields who are very conscious about what ethnography means. For instance, I know that in some strands of anthropology, there is a kind of a requirement that you at least need to immerse in a field site for 1 year or something like that. And that's not always doable for media and communications scholars because of obviously our work commitments as well that don't necessarily incorporate those long periods of field research. So it's ethnographic. Although we don't necessarily spend that much time in the field, we share that same interest in the everyday lives of people. We are very curious about the broader context in which people use online technologies. Okay. So what would be the value of ethnographic online research? Okay. First is that, as many of you perhaps already know, digital media are increasingly central to our human experience. So more and more digital media are, they're interwoven into many different aspects of our lives. May it be about education, politics, relationships, across the different spectrum of our lives, digital media is increasingly present. And of course, digital media has particular kinds of opportunities that it allows us to do, perhaps things that would have been challenging for us to do before. Now we can do, like these kinds of online seminars that bring together people, across space, across time, right? Which we didn't really used to do before the pandemic too much, but now we're beginning to see some of the opportunities of this, and perhaps something that we can carry on with even after we return to our quote unquote normal lives. But also, of course, digital media carries with it particular kinds of oppressions. The exclusions that exist in the real world, they also replicate in digital media. What I mean by this is exclusions in relation to class, gender, race, and even digital access, for instance. So all of this are replicated online. So it's quite important to pay attention to this. How is the digital playing out in our contemporary society? Because it contributes so much to the kinds of opportunities that are afforded us, but also the kinds of exclusions that are out there. And of course, I think many people are now considering doing online research precisely because of the COVID-19 pandemic. Not only has the pandemic intensified the digitalization of our lives, like we live most of our lives online because of this pandemic, because we can't really, particularly in Metro Manila, where we've been in a very, very long lockdown. It's very rare that we go out of our houses. So much of our lives are lived online, our work. But beyond that as well, because of the kinds of health and safety issues that we have as regards research, it's quite challenging to do traditional ethnography at the moment. And so that's why some of us have turned to doing online ethnographic research, given the kinds of constraints that we have in this pandemic. So what are the key assumptions of online ethnographic research? These are the things that underpin our approach to this kind of work. Okay. I think the first thing to note, and this is something that is obvious to media and communication scholars, but it's not always present in public discourse. It's this idea that the online and offline are not really separate from each other. The online and the offline are always inextricably entwined. They're very much interlinked with each other. So don't think of the online as something that is separate from the offline. They flow into each other and they kind of constitute each other. Okay, so that's why when we do online research, we don't think of it as something like entering a new world, very different from our offline lives. Instead, we think of it as an aspect of the overall context of people's lives. And because of that, one thing that we challenge is sometimes the still very strong technological deterministic approaches that people have to technology, or to the relationship between technology and society. By this, I mean this belief that it's technology that's shaping society, is influencing society. That's only one part of the argument, because obviously technology is also shaped by society. It didn't come out of nowhere, right? We humans created technologies, and so therefore we shape those technologies as well because of our use. So I think it's very good to come into the field knowing this, that the online and the offline shape each other in turn, and so we don't treat them as two separate things. And that informs a lot of the way that we work in an online field site. The second assumption that we have is that different digital media technologies that are available to us have distinct affordances, meaning they offer us particular ways of doing things. They kind of extend some of our capabilities. But at the same time, they also have what we call disaffordances with an I and disaffordances with a Y. Disaffordances speaks to how technologies prevent us from doing certain things. That's disaffordance with an I. Disaffordance with a Y is when technologies make it challenging for us because it's, the way that they offer particular opportunities to us misrecognize us in a certain kind of way. So let me give a concrete example for this. When we talk about affordances, think about how despite the pandemic, you can still carry on with our academic work. And that's because of the technologies that we have. Zoom, for instance, allows us this affordance of conversation that, there's a distinct way that we engage with people in Zoom, right? So we have this kind of function where I'm able to talk to everyone, but at the same time, we can use breakout rooms, right? To have more private conversations to simulate, I guess, group work and in face-to-face kinds of things. So those are the affordances of Zoom, the things that it allows us to do. The other thing that it can do, it's funny, but it's actually quite interesting, is that in real life, we come to the meeting, we come as we are. But on Zoom, you have many filter functions. You can beautify yourself, put digital makeup, whatever. So those are specific to this particular medium that we cannot have in everyday life, for instance, or those cat filters or those other things, right? But then it also has particular disaffordances with an I. And what I mean is that Zoom requires a lot of bandwidth. So for people who have challenging internet access, Zoom is quite a difficult medium. And so that's why oftentimes we find ourselves turning off the video, right? Because we just cannot carry the connection that well. And obviously in the context of the Philippines, that's more the case. In Western contexts where there is stronger internet connections, they can do so much more with these technologies. So we have that kind of disaffordance in the Philippines, shared by everyone, because our internet access is premised on, well, the really bad digital telecoms infrastructure we have in the whole of the Philippines. The disaffordances with a Y speaks about misrecognition, how technologies, for example, seem like they are able to offer you an opportunity, but because the technology does not recognize you, you're prevented from engaging with it. One particular example is on Facebook. They have a rule which they've kind of shifted already, but you're supposed to use your real name on Facebook, and that's for security reasons. And so for most people, that's an affordance. It's a security measure. But for the trans community, for instance, they don't usually use their given names to them, right? They use a different name to kind of signal the kind of identity that they want. And that's problematic with Facebook, because then you're seeing, it seems like they're giving you an affordance, but you can't use it because it doesn't fit with the kind of identity you have, and Facebook doesn't allow for your identity. I also know some students I've had previously who were Chinese, for example, and the romanization of their names only had 2 letters, something like Li, L-I. And when they're entering information online, there are technologies that require you a minimum of 3 letters for your name. And so they are disafforded entering their names. It says that their names are invalid. It happened to me as well also, because my name is Cabanes with an N, and they wouldn't accept that. So my name is not valid in one of those airlines that I was trying to get an online ticket into. So those are the disaffordances. So different technologies have different kinds of affordances, disaffordances, and disaffordances with a Y. The third thing is that even though you have these individual technologies with their specific characteristics, increasingly our experience of online media is through this thing called polymedia. We don't really think of it as individual things anymore, but instead we think of our online experience as constituted by many different platforms that are available to us. And so because we have many platforms available to us, the limitations of the individual platforms are overcome. Okay, so and the mobile phone is quite central to this, because the mobile phone, especially if you have a smartphone, immediately gives you access to many different apps. You have Facebook, you have Instagram, you have Twitter, you even have Zoom there, and all your education, all your work suites, they're all there on your smartphone. Um, and so you don't really think, I can't do this particular thing because Facebook doesn't allow me to do this. What you do then is you just use another app. So you kind of overcome the affordances and disaffordances of specific technologies. Instead, what we have are affordances and disaffordances of technologies all put together as polymedia, as an integrated communicative environment. So these are the key assumptions that we bring into the field when we do online ethnographic research. So again, to reiterate, we don't think of the online and offline as separate. And then the second one is that each technology has its own affordances, disaffordances, and disaffordances with a Y. And lastly, that despite the individual characteristics of the technologies we use, we often experience them as polymedia, as an integrated communicative environment. So with those assumptions laid out, what I want to do now is to share with you some of the key techniques. And this is not everything. Perhaps in the Q&A we can delve deeper into them, but I just wanted to give you an overview of some of the key techniques that we use in online ethnographic research. And I hope you don't mind that in this discussion, I'll draw from the kinds of work that I've done with my colleagues in the past years. So the first one is online ethnographic interviews. So this is kind of like the main way that some of us social researchers are doing our work right now. Although we might be interested in ethnography, we are really unable to go to our field sites. And I'll implicate Dr. Fernie Santiago on this. We're currently doing work on digital disinformation and how people engage with the digital disinformation that they see online. And initially, what we wanted to do was to go to our field site. So the city of Manila was one field site. We want to visit the place. We wanted to visit the places in which our participants lived in, their neighborhoods, to get a better sense of that. And also in Masbate in Bicol, we wanted to do the same thing. But because of the pandemic, we are unable to do that. So we shifted to doing online ethnographic interviews via Zoom. And in this work, you might wonder, so how is this ethnography if it's just interviews? I think it's the sensibility that you bring into the interviews that allows it to become ethnographic. So really in our interviews, we're not just curious about how they use technologies in terms of how people in the Philippines use technologies when they engage with this information material, but we're always asking about the broader context in which they use these technologies, in which they encounter digital disinformation. Okay, so we're always probing their neighborhood relationships, their relationships with other people online, their family, their background. So we all try to situate how all of those connect to the way that they engage with this information online. And then I guess what is also quite distinct about doing online ethnographic interviews that pertains to the digital is that together with listening to our participants and making them tell their stories about oh, I saw this meme, I saw this particular YouTube video, blah 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 blah. What we do is actually we pursue that afterwards. We take a look at the materials that they have mentioned in the interview. So to give you an example, what I have here on the screen is that we were probing our participants about what they thought about the relationship between Philippines and China and all the disinformation around particularly the Chinese nationals who are here in the Philippines and how they're linked to the spread of COVID. And of course, the disinformation there is that there is a direct link. It's because there are Chinese nationals living here, they are the cause of COVID. Of course, it's so much more complicated than that. And so when they would tell stories about the stuff that they see online, so for example, people who are not supportive of the presence of Chinese nationals here, they point out, that oh, there are trolls who try to spread this kind of thinking that we should welcome the Chinese nationals here. They copy pasted this particular script, the one that you see on the left of your screen, and perhaps some of you have actually seen this online. So we had to take a look at that, and also looked at the comments that were related to that. Then on the other hand, those people who are okay with the Chinese nationals living here, they talk about how racist some people can be online, that they put up memes, they have comments that say that the Chinese should leave the country, etc. And so we look for those materials as well. And so on the right of your screen, you're going to see some of those posts that are really very racist and vitriolic against Chinese nationals who were actually giving away free masks. So that's part of online ethnographic interviews, that for one, you are interested in the broader context of these people's digital media use, but also whatever they talk about in the interviews, you pursue that, you look for that online, and you see for yourself the materials that they talk about and the kind of interactions that happen around these materials. So that's one key technique that we use for online ethnographic research. Another technique is online participant observation. So meaning you yourself being part of that community that you're observing, trying to take a look at how they do things. Perhaps one of the most challenging bits of research that I've done with Jonathan Ong of University of Massachusetts in Amherst was the work that we did on trying to understand the lives of digital disinformation producers, or whom we call trolls in everyday parlance. We tried to understand their motivations for being trolls, why they were there, why they were doing this, how they could sleep at night, etc. So we did interviews with them, but at the same time, they gave us access to some of their social media sites where they were doing the trolling. Okay, so we could actually see how they would create the messages and how they would see those messages in particular chats, for instance. Okay, so we were seeing that from the inside. And because of that, we had a better understanding of how trolling operations work. Okay, and of course, this was in the aftermath of the 2016 elections, that the digital disinformation producers were still very open to us. They were open in telling their stories and sharing their work, and even giving us access to how they did things online. Eventually, not sure what happened there. Perhaps there was a command from somewhere to stop working with us, to stop revealing things to us. Precisely, maybe also partly because we put out our report on the thing. It's a public report entitled "The Architects of Network Disinformation." If it's a free to download thing, if you haven't seen it, and I think Oxford also came out with a different study, but this time because in our work we try to be understanding of the trolls, not to absolve them of their faults, but to give the context of why they do what they do. But the Oxford study was a bit more just black and white critical of them, and I think that made them stop sharing their stories. So that's one thing that online participant observation can do. It can really allow you to go in there and see how they do these operations. It's a pity because this would have been a good tool to see how they do. The new innovation that they have in trolling at the moment is seeding this information in online group chats and on Viber group chats. Unfortunately, we don't have access to that anymore because we've been blocked off. Another key technique that can be used, it's very interesting, it's called the walkthrough method. Tomorrow, Dr. Christian Culiandes will give her own talk, but I had an opportunity to work with her, and we were taking a look at, this time around, not, not trolls, but we were taking a look at how middle-class Filipino women had changing practices around dating and romance, and how mobile applications were central to that, and dating applications like Tinder and Bumble, etc. So we wanted to understand how these women use these technologies. And so the walkthrough method is an approach where, in conversation with someone, you ask them to take you on how they use the application or the software or the technology step by step. And there are apps now that you can use, even though we're doing things remotely, where while you're interviewing someone on Zoom, for instance, they can remotely share the content of their mobile phone screens to you so that you can see what they're doing on their screens remotely. And then they can take you on that step by step, like, this is what I do, and this is what I look at. And so if I see this particular information about the person, then I swipe left or I swipe right, etc. Or maybe this is how I build my dating profile. And they can show you the step by step of that. While they're tinkering with their mobile phone, you can see remotely the contents of their screen. So you can follow how they actually use the application. So this is a very interesting method that you can use, not just for research on online dating, but on many, many things. Like, how do people actually engage with stuff on Facebook, right? Or on Twitter or on Instagram? The walkthrough method will help you understand not only the process of what they go through, but because they're explaining it to you, you'll also be able to understand the reason behind that particular process. So these are some of the techniques that we use when we do ethnographic online research. So just some of the few of them. I'd be happy to take questions about the specific elements of how to do these things. In the final segment of my brief talk today, I want to highlight also some of the key challenges when you do online ethnographic research. Obviously, and to be honest, there's still a much wider scope of work that you can do if you're doing ethnographic research on digital media that is face-to-face. The pandemic really limits the kinds of topics that you can do. And in particular, if you're doing online ethnographic research, it is unfortunate, but it's true that there are participants that become harder to reach because in the Philippines, we only have what we call good enough access. We can access the internet, but not everyone has that strong, constant connection to the online. This notion of good enough access was coined by a colleague of mine, Cecilia Oitioko, and she talks about how we can be connected online, but only in a very good enough way. Puede na, but it's not the great access that country like Hong Kong or Singapore or Japan has, and that limits the kinds of participants that we can include in our studies. Like my colleague in the communication department, Cheryl Soriano, does work on PisoNet, for example. You can see on your screen example of the PisoNet terminals that proliferate in many cities in the Philippines. But to study how people use PisoNet, because it's literally PisoNet, you put in coins to carry on with your online activity. It would really require you to physically be there and see them operate these things. It would be so much harder to do a walkthrough, for example, if they're doing PisoNet. That's so much onus on them because of the very limited technologies they have. So unfortunately, the kinds of topics that we can do in online ethnographic research can be quite limiting. And of course, also when you go to many regions in the Philippines where internet access isn't very strong or the internet isn't very central to the lives of people, then you're kind of limited by that too. The second challenge of this kind of research is that as a researcher, uh, usually when you're doing ethnographic work, there comes a point when your research ends and you begin to slowly exit from the field. You withdraw from the field, so that you shift from someone who was kind of like one foot in and out of the field site, an insider outsider, to try to, you know, have a sense of what's going on there, but still have that distance of a scholar. That becomes harder when you're doing online work, especially once you immerse in particular groups, you become part of particular communities that are online. And then you make friends with your participants because you're also wanting to see, you know, what stuff they post. And part of that also is, of course, opening yourself up to them, that they can see. That's part of research ethics, that, you know, they open up to you, you open up to them. They also see what you post on your social media feeds. Um, but because of this constant connectivity, this 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 exit phase of ethnographic research becomes so much more challenging. The very recent work of Rosa Castillo elaborates on this conundrum, on this issue of how you might exit the field site when, you know, some people might get offended if, you know, after the research you unfriend them or you block them, right? So how do you manage those kinds of relationships, those kinds of things? Is something that's that we grapple with this kind of work. And finally, there's, when you go online, there's like rich stuff, so much material for you to work on when you're doing a digital ethnography. But at the same time, the ethics of it can be very, very complicated. Like, am I able to use this conversation, this chat that I've had with a person? Am I able to use something that was posted in a Facebook community that I'm a part of? Can I take a screenshot of that and publish it together with my research? So those kinds of questions, like when are you allowed to use materials? When are you allowed to screenshot these things? When are you allowed to quote posts from people? Because the internet has very, you know, has a diverse set of privacy levels, varying levels of privacy, then you have to think carefully about that too, and make that part of your consideration. I would suggest that to begin orienting yourself to the challenges of this, you might want to look at the document prepared for internet ethics, internet research ethics by the AOIR or AIR, the Association of Internet Researchers. They have a constantly updated manual that we in the profession refer to when we're confused about, so can I cite this? Can I use this material or not? I think the AIR document is now on its third version, version 3.0. And obviously it evolves as technologies also evolve. You have to keep yourself up to date with these things. But despite these challenges of online ethnographic research, of course, it's something that's worth exploring if you haven't yet explored, or to keep pursuing if you've done something like this already. And again, because of the current context that we have, and even though perhaps at some, hopefully, crossing fingers, this situation will end sometime soon, I think we won't be able to go back to our old normal, right? It's going to be a new normal, increasingly mediated and digitalized. And so therefore, increasingly fruitful for doing research that involves going online and working with participants who are in these online sites. So I'll stop here, and I'm very happy to take your questions. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Cabanes. We have two questions in the chat box so far, but there's also a raised hand from Sahara Saipoden. So, Ms. Saipoden, are you? Oh, I guess she's not asking a question. So let us proceed then to the questions in the chat box. The first one comes from Joel Hapay. And his question is, how can we validate the data we gathered from an online conversation? Would it be reliable? Can we consider chat and email as a resource for the study? Can we quote their thoughts from it?
Yes, that's a very good question. Like I mentioned earlier, that's part of the complications of doing online ethnographic work, right? Um, I guess the first part of the question has to do with the validity, right? And then the second one is the ethics of how you do online ethnographic research. I think with any kind of ethnography, not just online ethnography, uh, well, it's not really you don't necessarily always just accept what people say on the surface. It's not about judging people. That you're not going in there saying, are they lying or are they telling the truth in what they're telling me? I don't think that's as important. The more important question is, why are they telling me this thing in this way? And that's the more sociological question. So it's not necessarily a judgment of, sinungaling to, this person is lying or this person is telling the truth. But I think the more interesting question is, why is this person telling me this story in this way? And I think that's where you get the fruitful analysis for this kind of work. So with something like an online ethnographic interview, something that, like I said earlier, both Dr. Santiago and I are doing, that's the kind of approach that we take. Is we ask ourselves, I wonder why. We wonder why they've told us the story of, this is how they engage with social media in this way. And that proves to be a very fruitful line of inquiry, of analysis. As regards using materials, quoting materials from chats, for instance, and from email exchanges, I think that, well, at least in ethnography, in ethnographic research, one of the gripes, and I hope I don't get into trouble saying this, with institutional ethics boards in universities, is that it's always tends to be very bureaucratic, tick boxes. Do you have this permission form, blah, blah, blah? And are you prepared to do research? What's the first step, second step, third step? But in ethnographic research, that's not how things really happen. You go on the ground and then you discover that people have certain ways of doing things, certain values, certain customs. And the problem with ethics sometimes, the way you write it, is that it's very rigid. When I go to the field, this is what I do. Step 1, step 2, step 3. But the field can be very different from how you imagined it to be. And so what you need to do as actually, what ethnographers say is that the key ethical value in doing field research is sensitivity, not the bureaucracy of tick boxes, but like, be sensitive to the people that you are engaging with. They've opened their lives to you, so you have to be sensitive to their social dynamics. So with the kinds of chats, the emails, etc., I think the best thing to do before you quote any of that is to ask them, are you okay that I am going to use this particular material in my work? Just to give you an example, in the research that I've done with how, like I mentioned earlier, how middle-class millennial Filipino women in Metro Manila use mobile media for romance and relationships. Some of them shared with me the kind of conversations they had with foreigners who were being racist towards them, and how they challenged the racism of that person. I distinctly remember this chat conversation that one of our participants took a screenshot of. And the guy was saying, how come you know English very well? And this woman was very offended by that. And she said that, it's a little thing called colonization and globalization. And so that's how she answered. And I wanted to use that in my project because I thought it showed so much the agency of Filipino women, right? That they can take it to these white people who look down on them. And so I had to ask permission from my participant. Can I use these screenshots? And she said, sure. And then she sent me all the screenshots of all the fights that she had with foreigners. But what I did was obviously to redact the information, remove the names, remove the photos. But it's always a matter of asking for permissions, I think would be the best way forward. Thank you.
All right. We have another question from Perselindo Ding Ding. And the question is, can you give a clearer example of one similarity and one dissimilarity between disaffordance with an I and disaffordance with a Y?
Yeah. Okay. So disaffordance with an I uh, speaks of how a technology prevents you from doing something. This allows you to do something entirely. Okay. So like I mentioned earlier, or maybe let me give another example. Uh, in some parts of the world, Facebook once offered this thing called Facebook Free Basics. And I think in the Philippines, we have a version of that, right? The free data that we get on Facebook. Now, there's a particular disaffordance to that kind of Facebook access, and it's that you really cannot see what the actual story is all about, right? You see the headline, maybe you see the photo that accompanies the headline, but if you click it, you cannot because you don't have enough data credits for it, so it won't load. So that's clearly an example of a disaffordance, that it prevents you. There's something in the technology that prevents you from doing something that perhaps people who have complete access to Facebook won't be prevented from doing. Okay, so I think disaffordance is actually the easier concept to understand. Disaffordance with an I. Now, disaffordance with a Y is a bit more challenging. That speaks to how technologies are supposed to give you a particular opportunity, a particular affordance, but because it cannot recognize you as part of the quote unquote normal set of people who use technologies, you find yourself unable to access that particular opportunity. So this affordance with a Y really speaks to the oppressions of particularly marginalized groups of people, I think. The intersection of people who are marginalized because of race, because of class, gender, sexuality, disability, etc. So you're offered a technology that you're, or an opportunity that you're supposed to be able to use, but then because the technology cannot identify your category, it's not set up to understand you in a certain way, then you find yourself unable to use the technology. Like the example I gave earlier was putting up, when you're trying to log in your name or register your name in particular databases. And sometimes because the developers are not, they're not thinking about the diversity of family names out there, they want a minimum of 3 characters, right? So, and then your name has 2 characters, so it has misrecognized you, doesn't think that there are people whose names have actually just 2 characters. And so that becomes quite problematic. So that's what a disaffordance is. It's really speaking to a particular oppression of the intersectionality of race, class, gender, sexuality, etc. I hope that it makes those 2 things a bit clearer.
Okay, so the next question comes from Mr. Jeric Alico. And the question is online ethnography the same as netnography as used by other researchers?
Yeah, okay. I think there are many terminologies out there. There's online ethnography, there's virtual ethnography, there's netnography, there's digital anthropology, etc. I think that these different names might have slightly different ways of approaching things. So to me, it's not that one is better than the other. It's a matter of trying to see which approach kind of fits your purpose for the kind of research that you're doing. I don't think there's a hard and fast definition for these things because scholars keep on shifting them, what these definitions mean. Actually, when I was preparing for this talk, I got a little bit confused. I mean, as well, like should I use online ethnography or digital ethnography or anthropology? Because sometimes they're used quite interchangeably. But I guess if you are going to use them in your research, what you do is you trace how these concepts have been defined by particular scholars and you map them out. So you kind of know, okay, you show in your work that I've seen how this concept has been talked about by different scholars and this is how I want to use it. And I think that's fine to do it that way, as long as you acknowledge, kind of like you map out the different ways that these things have been defined by different scholars, so that you're not ignoring them and just using your own definition of these approaches. But generally, I think what they're threaded together by this interest in doing research that involves the online world, so to speak. And I think all of them would always argue that the online is not separate from the offline. It's always an interaction between these two. I think that's a crucial thing that's threaded across all these approaches that look at our online lives.
Okay. The next one is from Dr. Rasmia E. Datusaranao. So, and it goes, there are instances where it is necessary to use secondhand accounts because of cultural extinction, genocide, or other horrible methods of eliminating groups. In those instances, researchers tend to be reflexive about the fact that all of this is secondhand information. Can a researcher undertake ethnography research using secondary data?
Yes, I think so. As long as, again, as long as you are, like you said, as long as you are reflexive about your approach to the data, and that you contextualize the data that you're using and where it's coming from, but also crucially, you contextualize your approach to the data, where you are coming from, your particular positionality, right? So that all cards are out there. I mean, for ethnographic work, whether it's online or not, I think one of the key principles that we hold on to is that we're not approaching research as a kind of hard science, right? It's very much as a social science. And so being open about our assumptions, being open about our positionality is very much appreciated. So again, you're very right. As long as you're reflexive about where this text is coming from, and especially if there's really no primary source material, like you said, it's unfortunate that these things do happen. The secondary material you can engage with as long as you contextualize that. But again, crucially, that you contextualize yourself. How am I interpreting this material? Where am I coming from? And I think Dr. Collantes might speak more about this tomorrow, but really that feminist ethic of being reflexive about yourself and your position as a researcher. That's super important in any kind of ethnographic work, because especially because you're engaging in the field, you can't come in there not knowing how you are going to affect the people that you will be working with, that you'll be collaborating with in a project. So you have to be very, very careful and very, very sensitive of your own involvement in what's going on. Thank you.
The next one is from Jane Ruby Aspirin. And the question is, can you give us an approximate estimate of prevailing research outputs already available in the academic institutions in NCR that used purely online gathering data, massive, emerging, just beginning, etc.?
I'm not very sure. I don't think I can give that overview. I don't have a sense of, because I'm sure there are different fields who are using online research right now. And I would imagine it is increasing because of the pandemic, that, people find it very challenging now to go to the field site. So I would imagine this is a growing thing, but I cannot give exact numbers. But yeah, I think because of the pandemic, a lot of the, especially the people who are doing kind of like qualitative work that involves some kind of interview or participant observation or something like that, those have shifted online because well, there's nothing else you can do really. You're not allowed to go to the field site. It's really quite dangerous. But I would say this is a general trend that people are taking up this thing. And my sense also is that looking at people, my colleagues around the world, who are either doing qualitative work that is involved with other people, or they're supervising MAs and PhDs. I would say a huge number of them, or almost all of them, have been forced to go purely online because of the pandemic that we have. Um, so, but for how long and how this will change our practice will be quite interesting. Because once at some point we will exit this in some way, but I don't think we'll come back to what we used to do before. I think that online component will remain, because then we would have learned how to, it's a skill that we've learned already, and it would be quite a waste if we stop doing that when we've already developed some techniques, some best practices around that. And I guess the best thing to do is to move forward with that, to go back to some, of course, we do face-to-face field work, but also take the lessons that we've had during this pandemic so that we can also harness online research.
The new normal, as they say.
Mm.
Now, I do have a question. Well, since you shifted from offline to online ethnography, have you had any interesting experiences?
Yes, I think the thing with well, one of the things is that online ethnography really makes it harder. I have to be honest. Although this is such a great opportunity to learn how to do online ethnographic work, previous to the pandemic, I wasn't a scholar that did everything purely online. The online was part of a broader ethnographic approach, right? I really saw very much the value of going to particular field sites and trying to situate, contextualize people's digital media practices in relation to what I've seen in that field site. So that's where I came from. Okay, just to I guess connect a little bit with our friends at MSU. One of the things that we were doing before the pandemic was to look at digital labor in Philippine regional cities, and we actually went to Iligan and we worked with some colleagues at MSU IIT. And I thought that going to Iligan was so crucial for someone like me who's Manila-based to see how, what the real context is there. And that fed in so much to how we understood the digital media practices of digital workers in Iligan. So I would say that going purely online really poses particular challenges because you can't do that. You cannot see the context in that clear way that we do in the offline. And one of the challenges that I've seen coming up is that the connectivity issue is such a thing in the Philippines. One of the more recent projects we've been doing together with some of my colleagues in the communication and psychology department at LaSalle is to look at young Filipinos' experiences of cyberbullying and online harassment. And we could clearly see that we look for students who are we look for young people who are in school, and then we also talk to out-of-school youth. The majority of the out-of-school youth, you could kind of guess from their internet access that they were also not middle to upper class. They were primarily working class. And that affected the kind of access they had so much. And our interviews with them were so much more challenging. Instead of having a good flow of conversation, you would have your conversations often cut because their internet signal isn't that great. So sometimes you shift to purely voice and that will solve the problem. But in one extreme case, it became a telephone call because the online just wouldn't work. So I guess one thing to say is that it's not all rainbows, roses, and butterflies with online research. We have to confront this reality that we live in the Philippines, and there are key constraints. But of course, that feeds into our analysis as well of how these young people understand bullying and harassment and how they experience that, because we experience how they connect to the internet, with some of them perfect, almost perfect, near perfect connection, particularly those in the urban centers, and the others with very challenging connection. And what we did in the end was to incorporate that in our analysis of their experiences.
I do remember an interesting experience working with you well, basically, which made me realize how restrictive the camera can be in in applying a participant observation. So, like in your case, I can see the books behind you, a picture. Okay, but in some instances, you just see a plain blank wall, and there's really nothing else you can do but rely on the discussion. So, well, we have another question from Arlene Traspe. Sir, is there a specific time as to how long should a researcher gather data before it can be called an ethnographic study?
Yeah. So, like I said, I think there are some strands, and this is not for everyone. In anthropology, for instance, especially, I guess, if you're doing a degree like a PhD, for example, where they require you to immerse in a field site for 1 year, and that would constitute your ethnographic fieldwork. And some universities are very strict with that. But in the way that we have kind of adopted this in some of the other social sciences, like in media and communication, where we are not pure ethnographers, we're not anthropologists really. Like, I would think of myself as a media scholar who uses an anthropological approach, but I'm not an anthropologist. And so those time frames don't matter so much. What matters more is the sensibility that you take to your approach, that you are interested in the everyday lives of these people, in the contexts wherein these practices unfold, and that you take great note of those things. I think that's what makes it ethnographic, quote unquote. So ethnographic in this sense is a sensibility of being interested in the everyday lives of people, and how whatever it is that you're observing, if you're from poli-sci, perhaps you're looking at their political practices. And in our case, we're looking at digital media consumption practices. You situate that in that broader context. Although, of course, it would really do you well to spend some time immersing. It does take some time to, I wouldn't prescribe a hard and fast rule, but you need to kind of gain a familiarity with that site that you're looking at. Whether it's Facebook, that you immerse yourself in these groups, try to you get a feel of like, okay, I understand now the dynamics that happen in this group, or if it's a chat or whatever it is, you need to take that time out. So it's more of a qualitative thing, I guess, that you feel that you have a sense of how the dynamics work, and then you can begin writing up about it. Thank you.
We have a question from Facebook. Can you suggest a good reading material as a starting point to learn more about online ethnographic research? The question comes from Erwin Augusto. I mean, if any, yeah.
Yeah. I think one really good work that you might want to take a look at is this book entitled Tales from Facebook by Daniel Miller. He's an anthropologist who does media scholarship. And it's really, really fascinating to see how the meaning of Facebook transforms because of the different everyday life experiences of people. So the argument of that book is there is no one Facebook. Depending on how you are situated in your social life, you have a very different experience of Facebook from other people. And it's a good reading material because it's not like your typical social science work where you begin with a theoretical framework and then you have data. It reads so interestingly. The different chapters are portraits of different people who use Facebook. And then the theorization comes at the end to tie together everything. So it's kind of like, it's really an academic work, but it also reads like interesting portraits of people who use Facebook. And I've always used this book as kind of like a guiding post of how to write engaging online ethnographic material that's academic, but also will be good for popular reading too.
Okay, that's it. That's all the questions we have. Any closing remarks, Dr. Cabanes?
I guess the only really thing to say is that for those who are thinking of doing an online ethnography, um, it really is worth doing, particularly now that we are in this pandemic. I think it's really a great time to learn doing this thing because it'll also be of benefit for you even after the pandemic. The challenges will be there, but there is a growing community of scholars who are working on it. And I think it's by collaboration, by sharing best practices with each other that we can further develop this thing. And it's super important for us to do this in a country like the Philippines, right? Because we are number one when it comes to social media access. We are known as the selfie capital of the world, the social media capital of the world. We spend the most time online on social media. It's such an undeniably important part of our society. And so we need scholars who are able to do work on this particular topic. And certainly in Mindanao, there is increasingly, like MSU IIT is beginning, it's an emerging hub for this. So I think that needs to be further strengthened. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cabanes. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that was Dr. Jason Vincent A. Cabanes. Okay, now the next session, session 4, is on research methods in theater and performance by Dr. Jazmin B, Llana. But unfortunately, it seems that she's having some connectivity issues. So for now, please bear with us as we try to gain a secure connection. And in the meantime, I will be playing the promotional videos of DLSU and MSU. So I'm really sorry about the inconvenience, but I hope you understand these circumstances.
De La Salle University has existed for more than 100 years. It is cool to be part of this traditional yet global institution that embraces cultural diversity.
My professors have been so helpful and encouraging. They guide me to the right coursework and program. They continue to teach me to strive for academic excellence.
I'm comfortable with the facilities, particularly with the Learning Commons, as it offers a lot of rooms to study and research. Also, the assistance and support of library personnel are superb.
My exchange experience opened doors of opportunities I did not know I could have before. It was a very life-changing, unexpected journey, and it undoubtedly is the highlight of my college experience.
The program has helped me deal with people from different backgrounds and work ethics, and it is a learning experience that would forever leave a mark in me.
The Mindanao State University was officially created by law by virtue of Republic Act 1387 as amended. The principal author of this act was the late Senator Ahmed Tumukao A. Alonto Sr., the university founding father. MSU is the first state university in the southern part of the Philippines in Mindanao, and second to the University of the Philippines, being the first and premier state-sponsored institution of higher education in the country. MSU was formally established on September 1, 1961 in Marawi City, formerly called as Densalan, the capital city of the province of Llana del Sur. Aspiring to be the center of excellence in instruction, research, and extension by transforming itself into a globally competitive national peace university, MSU system is committed to lead in social transformation through peace education and integration of Muslims and other cultural minority groups into the mainstream society, ensure excellence in instruction, research development, innovation, extension, and environmental education and discovery, advance national and international linkages through collaborations, and demonstrate greater excellence, relevance, and inclusiveness for Mindanao and the Filipino nation. From a one-campus university, the Mindanao State University transformed into an 11-campus university system with a total student population of 82,064 and a faculty force of 3,444 in 2015. Each campus is headed by a chancellor or superintendent for the 3 integrated technical vocational education campuses. Presently, MSU is the largest government university in the Philippines in terms of student population. The university president is the head of the whole MSU system and is concurrently the chief executive officer of MSU Marawi campus. The president also serves as the ex officio vice chairman of the Board of Regents, the highest policy-making body of the university. The Office of the President caters all services to 11 campuses. It also oversees the the excellence of academic and support plans, policies, and programs of the university and all of its component entities, leads the institution in acquiring resources for the development and implementation of initiatives, guides important governance precedents, collaborates with a wide range of internal and external stakeholders, supervises the relationship between students and administration, and executes personal systems. The Office of the President is located in the Administration Building of Marawi Campus. Over the years, AMSU Marawi as the mother campus has transformed to an extremely modernized academic institution which holds aloft the desire to maintain quality education. At present, the university operation is complemented by the university's physical plant and facilities. These include the recently completed academic buildings that are equipped with contemporary classrooms, laboratories, athletic facilities, health service facilities, food service facilities, convention center, student center, gymnasium, dormitories, cultural center, and other facilities that are used to enhance the delivery of services of the university.
So I'm sorry, we'll have a short break, but we will resume at 3 p.m. Sorry about that.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. While waiting for our next Jazmin, thank you so much for staying with us. And also thank you for our participants. So we have 170, and we still have with us officials from other MSU campuses. Superintendent Dr. Tawan of MSU Llana, and research directors also from other campuses. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation to this international webinar. So this is the beginning of our collaboration with De La Salle University. So, we are very elated by your presence. Last speaker for today's session. In 5 minutes, we shall resume our webinar, and our next topic will be discussed by Dr. Jazmin Llana. All right, let's acknowledge some individuals who are with us. Dr. Abamo, our director for research. We also have chairpersons from different Marawi and other MSU campuses, research coordinators, coordinators as well. And we also have with us the Vice Chancellor for Research, Extension and Development, MSU Buo, Dr. Ruvi Bangis. Good afternoon, ma'am. Right. Earlier this morning, we had the chancellor, the chancellor of MSU Blue was with us, Dr. Nabdir Abdul Rahman. So I would like to thank the steering and working committees Mara have together to make this webinar possible. And of course, thank you to De La Salle University, Dr. Fernando Sanabria, is headed by the Executive Director of the International Affairs and Linkages of the DLSU System, Attorney Renato Pacaldo. Thank you very much, sir, for heading the committee. It is vice chaired by the Dean of the College of Social Sciences and Humanities, for supportive Dean, Dr. Professor Llana. Thank you so much, ma'am, and still with us. Ma'am, and the assistant dean of into the chair of the chairs of the various working committees with us this afternoon. Good afternoon po, my colleagues in the college. And the artistic director of the MSU Sining Cambayoca Ensemble, Director Mayan. Good afternoon, sir. And finally, before I end, there is still a second day for this webinar. We hope that you will still be tomorrow, as we will be discussing other interesting topics for this international on social research methods. And we are also hoping that this has been a great learning experience for everyone. By the way, I also saw the Dean of Dr. Abdul Cadayo. So we are about to begin the next topic. Let me turn on the screen to Dr. Santiago. Sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Alico. Allow me to introduce our next speaker. So the next session is entitled Research Methods in Theater and Performance. And our speaker is a full professor of the Department of Literature and the former dean of the College of Liberal Arts of De La Salle University. She holds a PhD in Performance Studies from Aberystwyth University in Wales, UK. So without much further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Jazmin B, Llana, PhD.
Hello, mayong hapon sa indong nga tanan. Marhay na hapon po sa indong gabos. Bicolano ako. May masyadong tataong Bisaya kan sa indong tataramon. But I hope we are going to have a fruitful afternoon session this afternoon. I would like to first apologize for the slides, so that in case there will be connectivity issues. I've had connectivity issues the presentation. I just hope that we'll have some time later on to have a discussion. my respects to all of the MSU community, administration, faculty. Thank you very much for having us with you in this webinar and for the beautiful collaboration that we have started with the program this morning. Let me share my screen. Are you able to see it? Fernie, am I okay?
We see it now, ma'am.
Hello? All right, great.
Yes, we see it now.
Right. Hello and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending this session. I am assuming that many of you who decided to stay on for this last session today are interested in the topic, even if you are not a practitioner in the field of theater and performance. And indeed, if you are not, I hope you would learn something that you can use for your own research, whether it is in the social sciences or in the technology and natural and applied. Study in how we can have a dialogue about research methods across disciplines. Oh, sorry. The focus is on two questions: what is studied, or what is the object of study, and how is the study conducted, or what methodologies and methods are used. This session is intended as a general introduction to doing research in theater and performance. We will be talking about a range of key approaches, some of the critical literature on performance research, theoretical frameworks, and research methodologies. I will also introduce performance studies as a broad interdisciplinary field before we dive into the research methods. Now, since this is a learning session, I prepared this slide as a suggestion on how you can benefit the most from the session, even if you are a non-practitioner of theater and performance. The invitation here is addressed to researchers of Philippine culture and art, but these researchers may well be from fields like engineering, information technology, mathematics, or biology, or politics, history, sociology, or anthropology. How might you conceive your practice, work, or project in terms of the performance paradigm? What might be productive uses of theater and performance research methodologies and methods for your own practice, work, or project? We will start with a discussion of issues in performance research, which would set the scene, so to speak. The main discussion is on 2 points: performance as object of study and I will elaborate on what is important about performance as the object studied, which can be likened to the specimen under a microscope, the what of the investigation. This thing is live, since theater and performance are live arts. we are looking at an oh dear. As important as looking at performance as object of study is the thinking of performance as method. Diana Taylor explains it in her book, The Archive and the Repertoire, that performance can be the method, not simply the object of performance studies. The challenge is to see and appreciate performance not as what it is, but as something that enables us, and therefore the focus is on what performance allows us to do. Be researched and studied. The ethical question is at the core of these issues, as it is with research in all other fields. That's why there is a research ethics review and approval of all research proposals. But unique to performance research is the challenge of doing research on something that passes, becomes a lost event. You watch a live performance like a play or a dance or musical concert, and it lasts for at most 2 hours or maybe 3 days. After this, all you have are traces of the performance. Your memory of it, or at most a souvenir program, a poster or playbill, or the director's notes. The issue then is how the researcher can put together an authentic document of the live. Having said that, let me digress a bit from the main outline to briefly introduce the field of performance studies, which is, let us watch this clip of Richard Schechner talking about the beginnings of performance studies from the intellectual ferment and political turbulence of the 1960s.
Richard, could you tell us how performance studies as an interdisciplinary or post-disciplinary field came about?
Well, performance studies, I'd like to think, has always been in existence. The question is what precipitated the particular relationships that we now call performance studies. By performance studies always being in existence, there has deep in Asian traditions, deep in African traditions, deep in even European traditions is the notion that performance extends far beyond what goes on a stage. We all know Shakespeare's famous "All the World's a Stage," but there's also in the Indian tradition the notion of Maya or Leela, that the whole is a is going on at the present moment, etc. So the question is that at a influence of ideas from sociology and from aesthetics that all seem to intersect at roughly the same place. Not exactly the same place, but roughly the same place. This place could be identified in several directions. One, there was a dissatisfaction with the analyses that were then going on and with the aesthetics that were then going on as part of the general challenge in the United States, in Western Europe, in Latin America, and elsewhere with whatever powers there be. It was sometimes called the youth movement, and sometimes called the participatory democracy movement, the wave of radicalism that followed colonialism, liberation theology. All of these things can be looked at as a kind of strong rebellion against established authority, whether that authority was governmental, epistemological, intellectual, or artistic. So at the same time, there was within the academy the move into the academy of a group of younger radical thinkers. If the radicals of the 1930s had more or less worked outside of the academy, with the exception of the Frankfurt School, the radicals of the 60s, a large number of us became tenured radicals, to use a famous phrase. And so that the question then was how to constitute this. There was a good deal of help from the French post-structuralists, but even before them from the structuralists, from Levi-Strauss and structural linguistics, and then from the rebellion against that, which actually absorbed some of that program. So that performance studies at that point began to first perceive of our own paradigm of enacted events, embodied knowledge. And this is part and parcel with certain of the political notions and social notions of putting your body in the street, of taking action, of Gandhi's nonviolent revolution or rebellion against the British, of Martin Luther King, of all of these things were to say that the body in action was not simply an instrument of something else, but was itself an epistemological and political and aesthetic active intelligence, let's put it that way, rather than a thing as it might be in traditional painting.
Richard, could you?
Another scholar, Tracy Davis, traces the emergence of BS to what she terms as the performative turn, coming in the wake of earlier turns, what Schechner identifies as the influence of earlier naturalism. Yes. First, the linguistic turn that focused on the role of language in the shaping of perception, followed by the cultural turn that emphasized culture as formative of identity. From the elite conception of being the best that has been thought and said, as propounded by Matthew Arnold, culture became ordinary, or as Raymond Williams put it, culture is ordinary, such that even the poor workers have it or participate in its making and enjoyment. The performative turn proposed an even more radical view, and this is the idea that collective influences become manifest in individual behavior, and that in fact behavior or performance embodies and shapes culture. Chris Salter, writing on epistemes of performativity, talks about how the performative turn emerging from anthropology and sociology attempted, as he says, radically to reorient the significance of performance away from its purely artistic bound connotations, and how such turn encompassed not only performance as the subject of research, but more radically the method by which research would be conducted. Performance as method aimed to challenge traditional understanding that saw the transmission of knowledge only in textual form and described with a critical, objective, God's eye distance from above, instead focusing on the tacit, nonverbal, embodied, and immanent act of doing research. As quoted on this slide, he declares that, quote, as method, practice, and worldview, it would not be an exaggeration to say that performance now is one of the central knowledge paradigms for the 21st century. And he goes on to enumerate disciplines now using this paradigm. Disciplines as diverse as it is therefore understandable that the practitioners of performance studies and performance research are theoretically eclectic, Catholic in subject interests, use Lyotard's term. The idea that knowledge is produced in bodies or by bodies is the radical proposition of performance studies, because it means that knowledge creation is no longer the sole domain of the educated, the so-called experts trained in elite institutions. As I have said it in my own work, performance in and of itself creates knowledge, shapes perception, and it need not be transformed or translated into verbal text or saved in an archive in order to matter, to be considered valid. This time by the philosopher Away, who says that art, and thus organizes experience, organizes us, and thus effects change.
Wow.
For in a way, art engages with the ways in which our practices, techniques, and technology explaining it, constructing it, and does it for us so well. And so we think we know what outer space looks and feels like, or inside of a living cell, or the world of atoms and molecules. But let me make a bold proposition following Noé, that art does this too, or does this for science, and in fact supersedes all other ways of knowing or producing knowledge, science included. Language. But then art goes a further step. It causes us to think what we know, to rethink what we know, how we know. I'm sorry. So, so, in summary, but of course at the risk of simplifying too much, each one related to the others. It is an field that is fluid and open and not monolithic at all, a field where disciplinary boundaries are contested. That's why sometimes it is self-reflexive, which means it interrogates itself all the time, questions its own authority, and therefore always addresses the ethical question. Not only what to say, but how to say it and why, and for whom, with whom. It is acutely conscious of the problematics of representation. So, on scholar Henry Bial puts it, and I quote, just as performance is contingent, contested, hard to pin down, so too is its study. It's not a body. Unquote. And perhaps this is why, as Chris Salter says, it has become one of the central paradigms for the 21st century. In a VUCA world, I'm sure you have heard of this acronym, which stands for volatile, uncertain, complex. This VUCA world, made even more so by the coronavirus specialty. If you're interested, you can check out published by Bloomsbury Methuen Drama in London. The essay titled Performance Studies 3.0 traces the development of performance studies as a field and likens it to an operating system, the OS of the computer. Check it out. Into performance studies, but I found that the concepts I knew were sufficient and in many ways incommensurable to what I wanted to study. To cap this part of the lecture, let us listen to Barbara Gimblett in an interview with Diana Taylor, where she talks about performance organizing concept, how research is conducted in terms of performance studies in an international context. It's a longish clip, but all worth our attention. Again, this is open access, and you can download your copy from the internet.
Today we have Barbara Kirschenblatt Gimblett, one of the professors in performance studies, also known as BKG to her friends and students, who is going to talk to role in performance studies according to you.
To use performance almost anything. So I would start with that. Performance is an organizing idea. World's fairs, food. Performance as an organizing idea is a very, very powerful concept. The second principle is to study events as performances. They may be performances, or they may be usefully thought as. Object literature, film studies takes us as object film. Performance studies takes us as object performance, not exclusively, but I would say that as a point of departure. We may depart quite a long way, but as a point of departure, as a kind of anchor for our thinking, performances are very important. So performance is an organizing concept, and performances study. First of all, the kind of performance studies that I like to practice, that I like to teach, involves behavior. And I think it distinguishes the field from a lot of other fields, and in many ways allies it with anthropology, sociology, theater studies, music, the other performing arts. That is to say, paying attention to what people actually do is extremely important. And what I would argue is that, and the way I like to think about it, is that performances can be a source of theory and not only a site for the use of theory. And contemporary performance, experimental performance, the historical avant-garde, performance traditions that are other than the ones that have historically been the focus of theater studies, offer theoretical possibilities that have and concretely at actual behavior. And that for me is extremely important, and to discover theoretical possibilities there, what I would call performed there are several of my courses that there's a kind of, I would even call it a performance studies pedagogy, indeed, that would make good on these ideas. So for instance, I teach a course called The Aesthetics of Everyday Life. This is a course that starts with the idea that performance as an organizing concept would be useful for thinking about the mundane, the ordinary, for thinking about that which does not occur on a stage, in a theater, in a framed situation. We then look for where the laundry. We do a whole unit on laundry. I show a marvelous film called Clothesline, and I like to take laundry. I try to think to myself, what's the limit case? Sleep? What's the limit case? You're talking about the mundane. So, get mundane. And laundry was a great example, and the clothesline, a fantastic example. It turns out that if you look closely at something very, very ordinary, you discover the degree to which it has the capacity as well as performative. And number of sites, everyday conversation, ordinary activities, things to do with the preparation of food, and food across the board. I teach a course on food and performance, that tourist productions, field trips, going to actual sites, working on concrete cases, museum theater, finding sites that reward close study and analysis. And the papers that students do for the courses all involve primary research, whether it's historical or it's contemporary, whether it's observation or it's archival. And I like research to be organized around a site, around an object, around something concrete that can be looked at in depth and analyzed in detail, where you can see actual behavior, contact with the sources, with primary research.
And what do you think performance studies contributes to a study of expressive culture in an international setting?
Well, we like to think, I like to think of performance studies as being intercultural, interdisciplinary, and intergeneric. And by that I mean it's interdisciplinary in the sense that graduate department of drama, but became a department of performance studies precisely because the disciplinary boundaries of drama did not allow us to go to the places and do the things we felt were important. Now, what does that mean? It means that intellectually we wanted to work with a much wider spectrum of concepts and approaches. But it meant also that drama, as it has traditionally been understood in theater departments, has tended to focus only in European the world. And those performance traditions many of them have not been divided up and parceled out into something called music, something called dance, something called theater, something called, puppetry. They've tended by their very nature to be multimedia, intergeneric. They've tended by their very nature to exceed the limits of European, the ways in which we've traditionally thought about European theater and drama. So interdisciplinary, intergeneric, and intercultural. I think we've taken our lead in many ways from the historical avant-garde and experimental performance, which is inconceivable without encounter with performance traditions and aesthetic traditions outside of Europe and the United States. And so performance studies, by its very nature, from its inception, it has this intergeneric, intercultural, interdisciplinary contour, which I think has been extraordinarily rich and extraordinarily rewarding. Yeah.
Right. I hope that was helpful. Now let us look at performance as object of study in more detail. First up, here is Richard Schechner again, whose videos, by the way, are on YouTube. Dispersal of performance studies in a manner of speaking. He produced a textbook on performance studies, but more importantly, he is one of the central figures of the field. But of course, he's not the only one, and there are others who in fact bring PS towards new trajectories of thinking and doing. Of PS as the broad performance, there is that anything at all can be thought and analyzed as analyzed as performance.
Performance studies is being, but everything that they're in motion, they are actually performing. They're doing something. If you're showing what you're doing, you're performing. So, for example, somebody is crossing a street, they're just doing that. Somebody in a movie is crossing a street, they're showing that they're crossing the street. It's recorded by the camera, and it may be part of an art film or a documentary film. If you study how someone crosses that street, how it is filmed, how it is integrated into an artwork, then that is performance studies. Very simply put, studies looks at, examines, interprets, and analyzes all different kinds of performances: aesthetic, social, political, in sports, and of course, what happens in daily life.
Going back to Chris Salter's writing about performance studies in the 21st century, this is performance, quote, operating across various epistemic and ontological registers and scales, from the microscopic to the operations of large-scale entities like organizations and scientific infrastructures, the manipulation of atoms, genes, bacteria, and instruments, the actions of human bodies, social colonies, and political programs that increasingly crisscross sites and locales, the abstractions of mathematical models, the material apparatuses of laboratories, and the social conglomeration of markets. Bacteria perform processes, scientists perform experiments, algorithms perform in performance, then what is not human, as Salter says it? What is the appeal of performance? Let me shift again. The appeal of performance as a worldview, especially when this no longer human bodies, minds, and souls. I would not venture an answer except to say that PS persists and insists on its open and fluid nature and approaches, which has been very productive and generative. Here is a way to show this: the journal Performance Research. The journal themes and topics show the wide range of objects of study that performance research can take on or take up. Politics, disappearance, animism, theatricality, generosity, aging, mountains, song, climates, etc. Issue 4 of Volume 23 on Reflection is the 100th issue and thus celebrates the anniversary with 100 essays responding to the previous 99 issues, plus the editorial on turning 100. In many ways, it can be mind-boggling. Does this field enable thinking of game structures on the one hand and being on sea at sea on the other? Radical education on the left, trans-performance on the right. Institutions, ruins, medicine, time, poetics. The range is incredibly diverse and exciting. And we can see how the boundary crossing is a matter of course. Performance studies ways and Karen Barad's call for creating urgent new ways of thinking about the activity of phenomena that we often take for granted, the world of atoms and photons, waves and wavelengths, microbes and microscopes that extend beyond human-centered ways of performing the world in all its vibrancy. There are other publications, of course. Performance research is only one of the many journals in the field. But you are right, I am promoting the journal since I am an associate editor. Do check it out and consider submitting an article. Here's another one you should check out: GPS, or Global Performance Open access, so you don't have to pay for subscription. You can read and download all you want, and you can also consider submitting a essays annual conferences. Started GPS only in 2016,
but it has now become a key driver of discussion in the I will linger a bit on the first one. Examples that it's literary text. You let the work speak to you. I the minute gestures and facial expressions of an actor to the social network in which theater is in question. And lighting. But as this blurb says it, the protocols go beyond a formal analysis to a semiology and anthropology of performance, where spectator and actor are equally objects. We don't have time to thoroughly discuss the questionnaire developed by Pavis, but I will show you the entire set to give you an idea how extensive and deep you can go into the work. Researcher has to lexicalizing any performance, bearing in mind that performances come in theories and methods of analysis are multiple. We are not talking only of Aristotle's Poetics or prescriptions or the neoclassical requirements of a good drama. And in addition, that there is an extreme diversity of contemporary performances. But the silent message here is that the researcher would need foundational knowledge about history, the history of theater and performance, about forms and genres and subgenres or micro-genres, as well as major strands of thinking about theater and performance. These would constitute the researcher's intellectual resource, but he or she must be prepared to be surprised, to be stunned by something totally new that would perhaps challenge everything that theater and performance. Pavis requires that the analyst must distorting mediations. As pointed out in the earlier discussion of issues, it is already difficult even for someone who directly experiences the performance to make an authentic account of it after it passes, and he or she is left only with the traces of the performance. What more for someone who has not personally witnessed the performance? Another starting point is the assumption that the performance was created by an author, who can be an individual or a collective. Decisions about each aspect, from the casting to the costume design, the sound design, the lighting, etc. There are reasons for those decisions, and these are part of what should be figured out in the analysis. Pavis uses the term mise en scène, usually heard in relation to film, and cautions that there is no one theory about it that the analyst can draw from. He defines mise en scène as the system of choices and organizing principles made by the artist. These choices and decisions are homogeneous, which is to say that they cohere or follow a logic. You might have heard of the term directorial vision or artistic vision as that which provides the unifying logic and constraint in the making. The terms Pavis uses are metatext and performance text. The metatext would be the coming together of the decisions made consciously or unconsciously during the rehearsal process, apparent in the final product experienced. The other term is performance text, and Pavis emphasizes that it is an abstract system, an organized ensemble or network of signs which are the result of deliberate process. Something always slips with not intended, wanting to shape and manipulate everything in the ensemble of signs that Pavis talks about. But total control is impossible. Pay attention to what Pavis terms as unconscious decisions made by the directors happen. And of course, there is little control of how the work is then perceived or received by the audience. Metatext or performance text is therefore something that lies in the distance between actor and spectator. An early form of this is dramaturgical analysis that offers a synthetic rather than an analytic approach. The focus is on what is called the dramaturgy that rests on the work's lines of force, as Pavis puts it. But this is a different discussion altogether, which I am not prepared to go into in this session, and we do not have time to do so, perhaps in a different webinar. Pavis identifies two types of analysis as reportage and analysis as reconstruction. The first one is like a blow-by-blow account of the performance as it happens. Obviously, this is not always or rarely possible, if at all, because the act of witnessing a performance requires total attention, especially if there is an intention to analyze it. The analyst is first of all an audience to the work to be analyzed, and the first act required is respect, paying attention. Certainly for conventional indoor theater, this is hardly possible. It might be used for something like an outdoor event, like a festival, but even that, I maintain, is better analyzed in the quiet of recollection after its occurrence. Analysis as reconstruction is the more possible method, but here again Pavis warns of the difficulty, as discussed earlier, of making an account of a performance that is lost forever after its occurrence. The reconstruction will necessarily therefore be mediated by many possible things, starting with the very capacity of the researcher to work with memory while dealing with intervening demands to his or her attention, as well as factors that shape his or her perception, including his or her embeddedness or not in the culture and social context of the performance. Pay attention to the well as the audience, their expectations and socio-cultural composition. Are they a paying crowd who bought tickets to the performance, or are they a random collection of people who gathered or stopped to watch on the street, perhaps? Pay attention to the nature and extent of these contexts. Is it a ritual or ritual-like event that occurs during a particular time of the year? Does it follow certain codes of behavior or conventions of structure and flow? And you can ask many other things in relation to these concerns. The questionnaire developed by Pavis is extensive, with very specific questions under each of the 14 items. It is a thinking tool by itself. For instance, on the mise en scène, the first question is what holds the elements of the performance together and what is disturbing about the performance. On scenography, what is the relationship between the stage and the audience and the colors, materials, and their connotations. On the actor's performance, what is the relationship between the actor and the group, the movements, ensemble relations, trajectories of movement. On item 9, on reading the plot through the mise en scène, what are the ambiguities in the text and how are they clarified in the mise en scène? On the text in performance, what is the version used? Is it a translation, an adaptation? And two of the final questions are, what did not of the mise en scène, and what was not reducible to signs and meaning, and why? Now, having gone through all that, it pays to look at another view. On this slide is a quote from Paul Ray in his essay in the book, The Rise of Performance Studies. Place and to which it contributes, I am suggesting what is it doing to me? Who is doing it and why? What does it mean and for whom? Where does it happen and how? And of course, see here the challenge to look not just at performance as it is, but at what it does, what it enables or not enable. In Philippine scholarship, scholarship on Philippine theater, mainly graduate research in UP from the 1950s. Marked changes in the object of study, the play text or dramatic literature during the first decade, the 50s to 60s, the staging during the second decade, and decade from the 80s to the 90s, the culture of theater, the studies. Let us now talk a bit about performance documentation. As suggested in the introductory discussion on issues, documentation may be a practical activity of recording, chronicling, rendering performance which is ephemeral into something that will be stored in an archive and can therefore be accessed long after its life as live performance. But other than the practical considerations of recording instruments to use or the challenges of storage, documentation grapples with the very issue of performance as a live event. Certainly, what is produced by documentation, like a video, is not itself the new work governed by another set of conventions and logic. In the book Thinking Through Theater and Performance, there instead of telling you what it talks about, I'd like to read parts of the essay so you can somehow hear the essay. Every autumn term, the first year students on the topic of site-specific theater. In theater studies, I refer extensively to filmed extracts from a performance to illustrate my points. In this case, my choice usually falls on Gododin, devised by Welsh theatre company Brithgoff in collaboration with London-based industrial music group Test Department, and which premiered in Cardiff, Wales on December 1, 1988. The work is widely considered one of the first theater pieces to be.
Yeah, sorry about that, Kev. We have to go back.
Every autumn term these past few years, I have given a lecture to first year students of site-specific theater. Like many teachers, disbanded Welsh company Brithgoff in collaboration with London-based industrial music group Test Department, and which premiered in Cardiff, Wales on December 1, 1988. The work is widely performance footage posted on Vimeo. I try and evoke for the students my memories of watching the show live when it came to Germany in the summer of 1989 while I was a student myself at the University of Hamburg. Gododin was the largest, most overwhelming piece of theater I had ever seen. It was performed outside the vast halls of the Camp Nagel Fabrik, a former grain factory that had been turned into Hamburg's primary venue for experimental theater. In a set of landscape proportions and involving real cars and trees, performers hurtled themselves into a sandpit that was being slowly submerged experience. My ears were filled with the amplified sounds of metal being thrashed Rhythmically, my body was being pushed and pulled as the standing audience surrounding the sandpit tried to jostle for the best place to catch a glimpse of the action or duck away as performers hurled oil barrels in our general direction, my nose registering or different. Here we are neatly packed into rows in the featureless space of a lecture theater. Crowd, weather, fire, water, charged event made grainy and tinny from years of repeated copying. Yet on the night, my sightlines were also often obscured by others. Sense of the density of impressions it received, so that upon each viewing of the footage, had since forgotten. And purpose and records like the Gododin video, it will consider the relationship between these records and the performance event that generated them. This relationship is generally discussed under the mantle of performance documentation. The term is less straightforward than it might at first appear, as it can refer to the documents like videos or photographs, the processes of creating these documents like filming or sound recording, or the cultural practice of compiling documentary records of past performance events. And what counts as documentary record too is far from simple. The French information scientist Suzanne Briette published an influential essay in 1951 in which she proposed that any kind of artifact can serve as a document as long as it is presented and studied as such. So, while we might associate performance documentation primarily with the visual and audio-visual registrations of live events, such as videos, photographs, or sound tapes, it can also include things such as rehearsal diaries, reviews, or props, and I want to suggest even immaterial forms, such as memories. Unquote. Next up, use researching theater. Do this because the how of it can be better explained by a historian. What I'd like in doing historical research from a performance perspective, what Adrian Kerr calls performative historiography. When a performance researcher does historical research, he or she does performative historiography. It is not a simple matter of instead, it is an act of constituting the past. That is to say, the past is made comprehensible by means of how it is told from the series woven together. For Kerr, this act of constituting the past, which happens always after the fact, always afterwards, is critical, creative, and politically effective, is oriented towards the future. It is an act of moving forwards while dealing with what he calls the politics of the present, which always intervenes in our view and constitution or reconstruction of the past. That is why, for instance, in our own context, in our politics of the present, we worry about historical revisionism and all the crazy talk about how martial law and the Marxists did good for the country. Ethnography in performance research is the same ethnography in sociology and anthropology, using immersion, participant observation, key informant interviews, but with a twist. It is used to research performance as object of study, but I'd like to take it up later when we take up performance as method. For interviews and focus groups, here is a wonderful example of how to do it in a performative way. Ensemble. What is your ideal is the central question of this project. How do you want it to be constituted? What is the mandate? How should it act? How do I relate to this government? What should it do for me and for my community? The Sipat Lawin Ensemble has been running the Gobierno institutions and create alternatives. A key question they are investigating with this project is what kind of performance context. Alison Sigara, currently the coordinator of the Gobierno project, describes it this way, and I quote, "The project activates audience agency as an opportunity to question and exercise citizenship and push forward the ideas of performance and performance processes as rehearsals for transformation, revolution, and collective action," unquote. Here's a video trailer of Gobierno that I downloaded from Vimeo. I am certain it's free to access and download, and you may tell your friends about it.
What are the things that you are concerned about? What sorts of things are on the news? We don't seem poverty and crime are connected. Export creation.
We have, like for example, what are you? Happiness expert, housing expert, and a radical community engagement expert. This city has everything. Policies na gusto nating makita. Integrated commuter train system.
Are you free for teachers?
Ano gusto mong marinig sa gobyerno? Dahil ang tao ay gobyerno, ang gobyerno ay ang tao. Lahat na gusto natin lumabas sa polisiya.
Okay, everybody have a speech. We're going to create the whole have a wonder.
Need people to do the following jobs. First, kailangan ko na mag-drawing ng ibon. People will decide the music for the city. Storytellers, ready? Citizens, ready? Yeah! Okay, this is the take. Ready? And action!
We are committed to, as a country, sa mga isyong ito ay
accountability and transparency in government spending. Action!
The lifeline of our city, the linear park on the water.
One of the city's many world-class hospitals.
I recommend another book as reference for your reading pleasure, Thinking Through Theatre and Performance, published by Bloomsbury Methuen Drama in 2019, fairly recently. As this poster says it, the book asks questions that theatre and performance are uniquely capable of asking. There are many examples here of performance as method. My chapter in this book asks how theater thinks through politics and explores the answer via an extended reflection on the practice of reenactment theater by the Teatro Obrero of Escalante Negros Occidental. Is radical research. The image suggested by Dwight that is heterogeneous, an ensemble, very much the way theater and performance work through ensembles of people, action, ideas, and a paradigm of methods on the move, not fixed or still, just as performance is always on. As I said earlier, it is within the framework of performance as method that I'd like to discuss ethnography and why. Research ethnography of the nature and intent of ethnography and its underlying conceptions of the objects of research and the relationship with the research It interrogates the authority of the researcher to construct statements about the research. It criticizes the view of culture as text, espoused, for example, by Clifford Geertz, and earlier theories about ethnography and the research endeavor, bringing into critical awareness the fact that anthropology and the ethnographic enterprise served the purpose of empire building and colonization in its inception. It is against scriptocentrism or the primacy and dominance of text over speech, behavior, performance, because, as Conquergood says it, the visual/verbal bias of knowledge blinds researchers to meanings that are expressed forcefully through intonation, silence, body tension, arched eyebrows, blank stares, and other protective arts of disguise and secrecy. It is ethnography with a performance lens, grounded in active, intimate, hands-on participation and personal connection, knowing how and knowing who from ground level in the thick of who became a colleague at Northwestern University, gathered his essays and published them as a book. I highly recommend this. And I have to mention that his ideas have in fact widely influenced the practice of ethnography, even in the fields of anthropology from which it originally came. Ethnography is very much an ethical practice or an unethical one, depending on the researcher's performative stance towards the research. Conquergood espouses what he calls dialogical performance, which can be the only site of genuine conversation. Or a cynical view of the other, or a relationship of authority. That is why it is a co-performance, which I find to be quite similar to our Filipino notion and practice of kapwa or pakikipagkapwa. I think dialogical performance is in fact none other than our own indigenous frameworks and methods founded on kapwa, developed in Psikolohiyang Pilipino. At least that is how I see it as a scholar trained mainly in the West, but attentive to the imperative of co-performance, that is to say with those I am with, here at home in my own country. That is why I am learning Sikopil and looking to reframe my own practice of co-performative ethnography using the indigenous terms and concepts. I have in fact done so in my own way already, using my own Bicol context and experience. Ethnographic co-performance in my own practice is anduyog, which in Bicol means being in total unity with the other. And drawing from Dwight Conquergood, anduyog as ethnographic co-performance has 6 principles: presence, paying attention, participation, visibility, reflexivity, and activism. Psikolohiyang Pilipino, but it has been very helpful as an attempt to develop an ethics of practice in researching theater and performance. So, in closing, let me sum up with the key idea that performance is both an object of study and a method of study. And I discussed the issues in performance research and the various ways by which research can be carried out despite the difficulty and challenge of creating an account of something which has already passed or is lost forever. In the process, we talked about examples and critical texts that you may want to further explore for your own work as researchers. As a reminder, here is our slide on the suggested learning outcomes. There is no exam, but I hope you can use this as an opportunity to benefit from this session. I will appreciate reading them if you would care to share your answers to the prompt questions, and I'm sure Dr. Fernie Santiago would gladly receive them for our center. How might you conceive your practice, work, or project in terms of the performance paradigm? What might be productive uses of theater and for your own practice, work, or project? Thank you for your interest and attention. I look forward to the discussion. I hope we still have time for that. Mabalos. Salamat.
That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Llana, for that very thorough discussion. We have some questions from our participants. And the first question that was asked was, how does one differentiate performance research with phenomenological research?
That's difficult to answer because phenomenology is something that is also embraced by performance studies as a methodology. So you might say that performance studies is a field and performance research is just a name for the doing of research within performance studies. And phenomenology is one of the theoretical, shall we say, part of the theoretical armature and methodologies of performance studies.
That question was from Ms. Jane Ruby Aspirin. Now, the next question is from Aurora Lynn Rakmat. And the question is, what is the dominant theoretical frame in the study of performance art? Under what conditions is a particular play, can a particular play be considered to be art?
Another difficult question, because these are very basic questions, I think. Well, my answer to the question is, I don't think there is a dominant theory at the moment in the contemporary world. There is no dominant theory. I don't think there is one anymore. And then I'm not sure if you're asking about performance art, as in performance art coming from the visual arts who do work really experimental, really radical work, or just performance as an art. Now, I'm not really sure what you're asking about, whether it's about drama or performance or performance art. You know, in the Philippines, we have a group of performance artists, practicing performance artists as well, and many of them are coming from the visual arts. What? Sorry, I'm not sure if I answered your question. What is a dominant view of what makes good art? There's heated debate about that. That's for sure. That's for sure. Yeah.
Okay. So the next question is from Mr. Jerry Alico. And the question is, how can we apply theater and performance research in our efforts to preserve the performance arts of Mindanao cultural groups?
Well, documentation is one way of doing that. The NCCA, I'm very active in the NCCA. The NCCA supports research that is intended to document practices, performance traditions, ways of or expressive arts, not of the indigenous peoples, of the Lumads, of the different groups, even groups of people in, well, not the Lumads, but in the centers, but identifying themselves as belonging to a particular ethnic group. Definitely, you can use the methods of performance research and performance studies. You can use co-performative ethnography. I am also in the business of doing that because my PhD dissertation, which I am trying to turn into a book now for the longest time, is on a performance tradition as well. Now, it's a Catholic performance tradition, which is a variant of the Santa Cruzan. No? So if you're interested, it's also featured in the Encyclopedia of Philippine Art, and you can read about that, and also a critical essay that has been written about it. Certainly.
The next one is from an anonymous attendee. Can news clips and videos displaying actual rallies be considered topics for performance studies?
definitely there is a subfield, you might say, of performance studies that looks at political performance or the performance of politics. And I've been trying, actually, Dean July here, we were planning on coming up with a jointly written article on political performance. I also write very much, at least 2, 3, 4 of my articles are on politics and performance. And certainly rallying on the streets and the actions of politicos, of politicians, of our president, of his minions, of supporters of, all of them can be looked at using the performance lens, and it's very exciting.
Okay, so due to time constraints, we only have one last question, but it's a 4-barrel question actually from Mr. Perselindo Dingding. So
Okay.
it's 4 questions in one. So what usually are the objectives or concerns of a theater or a live performance study? Are these on the who are the performers and the how this performance performed? How will you accommodate the slips, lapses, and errors of this live performance? And will you disregard these, or will these form part of your performance study?
Well, we come to a research project usually with an intention. It might be a curiosity about something. I don't think it's a way to kind of moralize or be on a high horse and say mali yan, mali yan, mali yan. No, I don't think that's the attitude that a researcher takes on, in approaching a work. And I suppose all of the slips and errors that happen within a performance can be taken in by the researcher, actually as part of the exciting details that he or she has to take into consideration in order to be able to say something about that performance. As to what is the focus of the research, that's totally up to the researcher, depending on what he or she wants to do. If it's about the actors, or the who, maybe it has something to do with embodiment or styles of acting, or maybe about the professional status or careers of the actors. Maybe it's about welfare of the actors, etc. But there are many, many other things that one can, focus on. That of course depends on, the interest of the researcher, the problem that he or she is trying to figure out or answer, and so on. The questionnaire by Patrice Pavis is a very handy tool. You can use that. And of course, you may not use the other parts of it to focus on just one. If you're interested only in the mise en scène, you're interested only in scenography, etc., you can still use that questionnaire. I hope I answered your 4 questions.
I hope you don't mind, Dr. Jazz, because there's just one last question that I find to be very important. It's a practical question, and it's from Mr. Ryan Katiwalaan. So I promise this is the last one. Here in Mindanao, we have a lot of cultural artists performing in different or various areas, but lack support from government. How could we get support in the government to preserve this culture? And who are those agencies, or what are those agencies that may help us support our cultural talent?
We definitely have to support the artists. I am with you in this in this aspiration and desire. I am part of the National Committee on Dramatic Arts, and I actually just came from a meeting of the committee, and the last thing we were talking about before I left was how to help the artists during the time of pandemic, and also looking at the future, how we can, because we are talking about disaster preparedness and resilience and things like that. So how can we help the artists in our field of theater and performance. And of course, there are many ways that we can do that by continuing the grants program of the NCCA, for example, and then by making possible the availment of certain welfare grants, for instance. It may not be directly from government, but it can be facilitated by groups like ours, the Committee on Dramatic Arts. At the same time, we have to increase the budget for culture and the arts. There is a group in Congress led by Congressman Christopher De Venecia, with whom we were in conversation, I think, a week ago, because they are doing consultations with sectors in the performing arts and other sectors, subsectors of the arts and culture block, in order to determine exactly the answer to your question. And I think they are gearing up for Bayanihan 3, and at the same time, they're requesting or soliciting proposals for possible congressional support. So we're now looking at not only NCCA, but also Congress. And there are many other ways that we can do that. I've been active in the NCCA, not only in the Committee on Dramatic Arts. I also I initiated the setting up of the research program of the NCCA some years ago. Now, we started in 2016. It was set up in 2017. I was the founding chair, and we have been able to set it up from a fund of 2 million pesos only for the entire country for research on culture and the arts. Now we're in the 6 million, and we've been able to support many researchers doing work in the field of theater and performance, in visual arts, in heritage research, and so on and so forth. And what we need to do is really to collaborate, with people we know who can help, and help ourselves. In many ways, we should be able to help ourselves as artists and as scholars. Thank you for all your questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Llana. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Jazmin B. Llana. So now we end this day's session, and we will resume tomorrow for another set of lectures starting at 10 o'clock in the morning. So see you tomorrow. Thank you. Have a pleasant afternoon. And for those asking, you may use the same link to access the webinar tomorrow. Again, thank you and have a pleasant afternoon. Bye.